The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain by John Henry Ingram. Section 12. Canterbury. In his celebrated Athenae Oxonenses, Anthony A. Wood, the learned antiquary, states that Dr. Jacob, a well-known medical man, told him the following marvelous relation of an apparition that visited his house at Canterbury. This very story, records A. Wood, Dr. Jacobs told me himself, being then at Lord Tenham's in Kent, where he was then physician to my eldest son, whom he recovered from a fever. Dr. Jacob also repeated the relation in a letter, which Aubrey, the antiquary, alludes to in his Miscellanies. The story is that the learned Henry Jacob, a fellow of Merton College, Oxford, died at Dr. Jacob's house at Canterbury, about a week after Henry Jacob's death. The doctor being in bed and awake, and the moon shining bright into his room, he beheld his deceased cousin standing by the bedside in his shirt, with a white cap on his head, and his mustachios turning up, as when he was alive. The doctor pinched himself to be assured that he was awake, and turned to the other side away from the apparition. After some time he plucked up courage to turn towards it again, and Henry Jacob stood there still. The doctor would have spoken to him, but could not, for which he has been sorry ever since. In some little time the apparition disappeared. Not long after this incident, the cookmaid, going out to the woodpile one evening to fetch some wood for the kitchen fire, averred that she saw the apparition of Mr. Henry in his shirt, standing on the pile of wood. This spectre does not seem to have troubled the doctor any more, but it is stated that when dying, Henry Jacob would fain have told his cousin something, but was not able to. It is imagined, says Aubrey, that he would have informed Dr. Jacob with what person he had deposited the manuscripts of his own writings, which were all the riches he had, and which, it was strongly suspected, fell into the hands of a certain person who printed them under his own name. If anything could bring an author's spirit back to this sphere, certainly such an outrage on his memory would. End of Section 12. Section 13. Cawood Castle. Anyone conversant with the less-known judicial records of the past is well aware that supernatural evidence frequently formed an important factor in ancient criminal trials. One of these curious cases is recorded in Aubrey's Miscellanies, that medley of useful and useless matters, as having taken place in the immediate vicinity of Cawood Castle, Yorkshire. The depositions made at the trial, but for one extraordinary and all-important piece of evidence, were of commonplace type. According to the circumstances brought out in the course of investigation, the facts were these. On Monday, the 14th of April, 1690, William Barwick was out walking with his wife, Mary Barwick, close to Cawood Castle. From motives not divulged at the trial, although shrewdly guessed at by Aubrey, he determined to murder her, and finding a pond conveniently at hand, he threw her in. Deeming, doubtless, that the body would soon be discovered where it was, he went the next day to the place, procured a huge spade, and, getting the corpse out of the water, made a grave close by, and buried it. Apparently satisfied that no one had witnessed his ghastly deed, Barwick actually went on the day he had committed the murder to his wife's sister, and informed her husband, Thomas Lofthouse, that he had taken his wife to a relative's house in Selby, and left her there. Lofthouse, however, according to his deposition on oath, averred that on the Tuesday after the visit of Barwick, about half an hour after 12 of the clock, in the daytime, he was watering quickwood, and as he was going for the second pail, there appeared, walking before him, an apparition in the shape of a woman. Soon after, she sat down over against the pond, on a green hill. He walked by her as he went to the pond, and as he came with the pail of water from the pond, looking sideways to see if she sat in the same place, which he saw she did. The witness then observed that the apparition was dandling something like a white bag on her lap, evidently suggestive, indeed, of her unborn babe that was slain with her. Lofthouse now emptied his pail of water, so he averred, and then stood in the yard of his house to see if he could still see the woman's figure, but she had disappeared. He described her attire as exactly similar to that worn by his sister-in-law at the time of her murder, but remarked that she looked extremely pale, and that her teeth were visible, her visage being like his wife's sister. Notwithstanding the horror of this apparition, Lofthouse, according to Aubrey's account, did not mention anything about it to his wife till night-time, when, at his family duty of prayers, the thoughts of the apparition were so overpowering that they interrupted his devotion. After he had made an end of his prayers, therefore, he told the whole story of what he had seen to his wife, who, laying the whole circumstances together, immediately inferred that her sister was either drowned or otherwise murdered, and desired her husband to look after her the next day, which was Wednesday in Easter week. Lofthouse now recalled to mind what Barwick had told him about having left his wife at his uncle's at Selby, and therefore went to him and made inquiries, and found that neither the man nor his wife had been seen or heard of there. This information, coupled with the appearance of the apparition, increased his suspicions against Barwick to such a degree that he went before the Lord Mayor of York, and obtained a warrant for the arrest of his brother-in-law. The culprit, when arrested, confessed the crime, and the body of the murdered woman, being disinterred, was found dressed in clothing similar, apparently, to that worn by the apparition. Ultimately, Barwick suffered the extreme penalty of the law for his crime. End of Section 13. Section 14. Chedworth. According to an anecdote related by Mrs. Crawford in the Metropolitan Magazine for 1836, Chedworth, the seat of Lord Chedworth, in Gloucestershire, has not escaped the fate common to the residents of most noble families. That is to say, it has a story of an apparition attached to it. The account of this circumstance is stated to have been told to Mrs. Crawford by Miss Wright, the adopted child of Lord Chedworth, and daughter of a sister of his. The story, as told by his niece, was that Lord Chedworth had great doubts as to the existence of the soul in another world, doubts which were equally shared by a gentleman for whom he had a very great friendship. One morning Miss Wright remarked, when her uncle joined her at the breakfast table, that he was very thoughtful, had no appetite, and was unusually silent. At last he said, "Molly," for thus he was accustomed to call his niece, "I had a strange visitor last night. My old friend B. came to me." "What?" said Miss Wright. "Did he come after I went to bed?" "His spirit did," said Lord Chedworth, solemnly. "Oh, my dear uncle, how could the spirit of a living man appear?" she said, smiling. "He is dead, beyond doubt," replied his lordship. "Listen, and then laugh as much as you please. I had not entered my bedroom many minutes when he stood before me. Like you, I could not believe that I was looking on the living man, and so accosted him. But he, the spirit, answered, 'Chedworth, I died this night at 8 o'clock. I came to tell you there is another world beyond the grave. There is a righteous God that judgeth all.' Depend upon it, uncle, it was only a dream." But even as Miss Wright was still speaking, a groom on horseback rode up the avenue, and immediately afterwards delivered a letter to Lord Chedworth, announcing the sudden death of his friend. End of section 14.
Section 16. Corby Castle, Cumberland. The apparition of a radiant boy, as it is called, is not uncommon in the history of haunted buildings, as various sections of this work will show. Dr. Kerner, the great German authority on spectral affairs, cites an instance of one of these apparitions which was believed to appear only once in 7 years, and to be connected in some way with the murder of a child by its mother. Mrs. Crowe, in her Night Side of Nature, refers to the well-known tradition that C. Corby Castle, Cumberland, is haunted by a spirit of this description. A friend of the family owning this ancient dwelling is authority for the following account of an appearance of the ghostly visitant. It is copied from a manuscript volume, and it is dated C. Castle, December 22nd, 1824. In order to introduce my readers to the haunted room, I will mention that it forms part of the old house, with windows looking into the court, which in early times was deemed a necessary security against an enemy. It adjoins a tower built by the Romans for defense, for C was properly more a border tower than a castle of any consideration. There is a winding staircase in this tower, and the walls are from 8 to 10 feet thick. When the times became more peaceable, our ancestors enlarged the arrow-slit windows and added to that part of the building which looks towards the river Eden, the view of which, with its beautiful banks, we now enjoy. But many additions and alterations have been made since then. To return to the room in question, I must observe that it is by no means remote or solitary, being surrounded on all sides by chambers that are constantly inhabited. It is accessible by a passage cut through a wall 8 feet in thickness, and its dimensions are 21 by 18. One side of the wainscoting is covered with tapestry. The remainder is decorated with old family pictures and some ancient pieces of embroidery, probably the handiwork of nuns. Over a press, which has doors of Venetian glass, is an ancient oaken figure, with a battle-axe in his hand, which was one of those formerly placed on the walls of the city of Carlisle to represent guards. There used to be also an old-fashioned bed and some dark furniture in this room, but so many were the complaints of those who slept there, that I was induced to replace some of these articles of furniture by more modern ones, in the hope of removing a certain air of gloom which I thought might have given rise to the unaccountable reports of apparitions and extraordinary noises which were constantly reaching us. But I regret to say I did not succeed in banishing the nocturnal visitor, which still continues to disturb our friends. I shall pass over numerous instances, and select one as being especially remarkable, from the circumstance of the apparition having been seen by a clergyman well known and highly respected in this county, who, not 6 weeks ago, repeated the circumstances to a company of 20 persons, amongst whom were some who had previously been entire disbelievers in such appearances. The best way of giving you these particulars will be by subjourning an extract from my journal, entered at the time the event occurred. September 8, 1803. Amongst other guests invited to C. Castle came the Reverend Henry A. of Redburg, and rector of Greystoke, with Mrs. A., his wife, who was a Miss S. of Ulverstone. According to previous arrangements, they were to have remained with us some days, but their visit was cut short in a very unexpected manner. On the morning after their arrival, we were all assembled at breakfast, when a chaise and four dashed up to the door in such haste that it knocked down part of the fence of my flower garden. Our curiosity was, of course, awakened to know who could be arriving at so early an hour, when, happening to turn my eyes toward Mr. A, I observed that he appeared extremely agitated. "It is our carriage," said he. "I am very sorry, but we must absolutely leave you this morning." We naturally felt and expressed considerable surprise, as well as regret, at this unexpected departure, representing that we had invited Colonel and Mrs. S, some friends whom Mr. A particularly desired to meet, to dine with us on that day. Our expostulations, however, were vain. The breakfast was no sooner over than they departed, leaving us in consternation to conjecture what could possibly have occasioned so sudden an alteration in their arrangements. I really felt quite uneasy lest anything should have given them offense, and we reviewed all the occurrences of the preceding evening in order to discover, if offense there was, whence it had arisen. But our pains were vain, and after talking a great deal about it for some days, other circumstances banished the matter from our minds. It was not till we, some time afterwards, visited the part of the county in which Mr. A resides, that we learned the real cause of his sudden departure from C. The relation of the fact, as it here follows, is in his own words. Soon after we went to bed, we fell asleep. It might be between 1 and 2 in the morning when I awoke. I observed that the fire was totally extinguished, but although that was the case, and we had no light, I saw a glimmer in the center of the room, which suddenly increased to a bright flame. I looked out, apprehending that something had caught fire, when, to my amazement, I beheld a beautiful boy, clothed in white, with bright locks resembling gold, standing by my bedside, in which position he remained some minutes, fixing his eyes upon me with a mild and benevolent expression. He then glided gently towards the side of the chimney, where it is obvious there is no possible egress, and entirely disappeared. I found myself again in total darkness, and all remained quiet until the usual hour of rising. I declare this to be a true account of what I saw at C Castle, upon my word as a clergyman. Mrs. Crowe, in alluding to this story in her above-mentioned book, remarks that she was acquainted with some of the family and several of the friends of the Reverend Henry A, who, she continues, is still alive, though now an old man, and I can most positively assert that his own conviction with regard to the nature of this appearance has remained ever unshaken. The circumstance made a lasting impression upon his mind, and he never willingly speaks of it, but when he does, it is always with the greatest seriousness, and he never shrinks from avowing his belief that what he saw admits of no other interpretation than the one he then put upon it. As a pendant to this narrative, it will be appropriate to relate the story of the Radiant Boy, so well known in traditionary lore as having appeared to the second Marquis of Londonderry, better known as Lord Castlereagh, whilst on a visit to a gentleman resident in the north of Ireland. The time of this visit would appear to have been about the end of the last century. The story has been variously detailed by different writers, but in the following account, derived from Mrs. Crowe's Ghost Stories, it is less romantically told than usual, and consequently has a greater air of vraisemblance. In this form, it is stated to have been obtained from a member of the Marquis's family. Captain Stewart, afterwards Lord Castlereagh, reads the account. When he was a young man, happened to be quartered in Ireland. He was fond of sport, and one day the pursuit of game carried him so far that he lost his way. The weather, too, had become very rough, and in this strait he presented himself at the door of a gentleman's house, and sending in his card, requested shelter for the night. The hospitality of the Irish country gentry is proverbial. The master of the house received him warmly, said he feared he could not make him so comfortable as he could have wished, his house being full of visitors already, added to which some strangers, driven by the inclemency of the night, had sought shelter before him, but that such accommodations as he could give he was heartily welcome to. Whereupon he called his butler, and, committing his guest to his good offices, told him he must put him up somewhere, and do the best he could for him. There was no lady, the gentleman being a widower. Captain Stewart found the house crammed, and a very jolly party it was. His host invited him to stay, and promised him good shooting if he would prolong his visit a few days. And, in fine, he thought himself extremely fortunate to have fallen into such pleasant quarters. At length, after an agreeable evening, they all retired to bed, and the butler conducted him to a large room, almost divested of furniture, but with a blazing peat fire in the grate, and a shakedown on the floor composed of cloaks and other heterogeneous materials. Nevertheless, to the tired limbs of Captain Stewart, who had had a hard day's shooting, it looked very inviting. But before he lay down, he thought it advisable to take off some of the fire, which was blazing up the chimney in what he thought an alarming manner. Having done this, he stretched himself upon the couch, and soon fell asleep. He believed he had slept about a couple of hours, when he awoke suddenly, and was startled by such a vivid light in the room that he thought it was on fire. But in turning to look at the grate, he saw the fire was out, though it was from the chimney the light proceeded. He sat up in bed, trying to discover what it was, when he perceived, gradually disclosing itself, the form of a beautiful naked boy, surrounded by a dazzling radiance. The boy looked at him earnestly, and then the vision faded, and all was dark. Captain Stewart, so far from supposing that what he had seen to be of a spiritual nature, had no doubt that the host or the visitors had been amusing themselves at his expense, and trying to frighten him. Accordingly, he felt indignant at the liberty, and on the following morning, when he appeared at breakfast, he took care to evince his displeasure by the reserve of his demeanor, and by announcing his intention to depart immediately. The host expostulated, reminding him of his promise to stay and shoot. Captain Stewart coldly excused himself, and at length the gentleman, seeing something was wrong, took him aside and pressed for an explanation, whereupon Captain Stewart, without entering into particulars, said that he had been made the victim of a sort of practical joking that he thought quite unwarrantable with a stranger. The gentleman considered this not impossible among a parcel of thoughtless young men, and appealed to them to make an apology, but one and all, on their honor, denied the impeachment. Suddenly a thought seemed to strike him. He clapped his hand to his forehead, uttered an exclamation, and rang the bell. "Hamilton," said he to the butler, "where did Captain Stewart sleep last night?" "Well, sir," replied the man in an apologetic tone, "you know every place was full. The gentlemen were lying on the floor, 3 or 4 in a room, so I gave him the boys' room. But I lit a blazing fire to keep him from coming out." "You were very wrong," said the host. "You know I have positively forbidden you to put anyone there, and have taken the furniture out of the room to ensure its not being occupied." Then, retiring with Captain Stewart, he informed him very gravely of the nature of the phenomenon he had seen, and at length, being pressed for further information, he confessed that there existed a tradition in his family that whomever the radiant boy appeared to would rise to the summit of power, and when he had reached the climax, would die a violent death. "And I must say," he added, "the records that have been kept of his appearance go to confirm this persuasion." It is scarcely necessary to remind the reader that subsequently Lord Castlereagh became head of the government and finally perished by his own hand. Section 17. Kotaki Castle. Of all of the haunted castles in Great Britain, none probably has acquired a greater amount of notoriety than that of Kotaki Castle, the seat of the Earl of Airlie. This ancient stronghold is haunted by the spirit of a drummer, and whenever his drum is heard, it may be accepted, according to the popular belief, as a token of the speedy death of a member of the Ogilvy family. The origin of this tradition is that either the drummer or some officer whose emissary he was had excited the jealousy of a former Lord Airlie, and that, in consequence, he was put to death by being thrust into his own drum and flung from the window of the tower in which is situated the chamber where his music is, apparently, chiefly heard. It is said that he threatened to haunt the family if his life were taken, and he would appear to be as good, or rather as bad, as his word. The strain of his invisible drum having been heard several times, even in the memory of living persons, and once, notoriously, quite recently. The authoress, who gives the following account of a somewhat recent occasion when the drummer was heard performing upon his ill-omened instrument, introduces it by the remark that about Christmas, 1844, a letter just received from a member of a distinguished Perthshire family was sent to her for perusal. The sender, an eminent literary man, accompanied the communication with the remark, "Read the enclosed, and we shall now have an opportunity of observing if any event follow the prognostic." The information afforded by the letter was to the following effect. Miss Dalrymple, a relative of the present Lady C, who had been staying some time with the Earl and Countess at their seat near Dundee, was invited to spend a few days at Kotaki Castle with the Earl and Countess of Airlie. She went, and whilst she was dressing for dinner the first evening of her arrival, she heard a strain of music under her window, which finally resolved itself into the well-defined sound of a drum. When her maid came upstairs, she made some inquiries about the drummer that was playing near the house, but the maid knew nothing on the subject. For the moment the circumstance passed from Miss Dalrymple's mind, but recurring to her again during the dinner, she said, addressing Lord Airlie, "My lord, who is your drummer?" Upon which his lordship turned pale, Lady Airlie looked distressed, and several of the company, who all heard the question, embarrassed; whilst the lady, perceiving that she had made some unpleasant allusion, although she knew not to what their feelings referred, forbore further inquiry till she reached the drawing-room, when, having mentioned the circumstance again to a member of the family, she was answered, "What? Have you never heard of the drummer boy?" "No," replied Miss Dalrymple. "Who in the world is he?" "Why," replied the other, "he is a person who goes about the house playing his drum whenever there is a death impending in the family. The last time he was heard was shortly before the death of the last countess, the Earl's former wife, and that is why Lord Airlie became so pale when you mentioned it. The drummer is a very unpleasant subject in this family, I assure you." Miss Dalrymple was naturally much concerned, and indeed not a little frightened at this explanation, and her alarm being augmented by hearing the sounds on the following day, she took her departure from Kotaki Castle and returned to Lord C.'s, stopping on her way to call on some friends, where she related this strange circumstance to the family, through whom the information reached me. This affair was generally known in the North, and we awaited the event with interest. The melancholy death of the Countess, about 5 or 6 months afterwards at Brighton, sadly verified the prognostic. I have heard that a paper was found on her desk after her death, declaring her conviction that the drum was for her, and it has been suggested that probably the thing preyed upon her mind and caused the catastrophe. But, in the first place, from the mode of her death, that does not appear to be the case, and in the second, even if it were, the fact of the verification of the prognostic remains unaffected. Besides which, those who insist upon taking refuge in this hypothesis are bound to admit that before people living in the world like Lord and Lady Airlie could attach so much importance to the prognostic as to entail such fatal effects, they must have had very good reasons for believing in it. The incidents just narrated took place, it will be recollected, in 1844. 5 years later, or, to be more precise, on the evening of the 19th of August, 1849, a young English gentleman was on his way to the Toolchin, a shooting lodge belonging to the Earl of Airlie. He was mounted on a stout pony, having a stalwart Highlander for his guide across the wild Forfarshire moor. For about 2 hours darkness had fallen upon the scenes. That is to say, it was about 8:30 in the evening when the welcome lights, issuing from the windows of the Toolchin, met our traveller's anxious gaze. At the same moment a swell of faint music smote suddenly upon his ear. The sound was as that of a distant band, accompanied by the drum, and appeared to emanate from the low ridge of ground below the hunting lodge in front of him. As it was wafted in louder accents across the moor, he could not forbear from feeling that it had something of an eerie and unearthly character about it. Astonished at such an unaccountable occurrence in a spot where the Toolchin was the only house within many miles, and where bracken, brown heath, and morass stretched far and wide upon every side of him, the young man called the attention of his guide to the strange burst of music which he had just heard. Muttering that such sounds were no canny, and professing that to him they were inaudible, the Highlander urged on his pony to as great a speed as the weary beast could exert after a journey of 25 miles, and in a little while the two riders drew rein at the hospitable door of the lodge. Upon descending from his pony, the Englishman learnt that his friend and host, Lord Ogilvy, afterwards 10th Earl of Airlie, had been summoned to London on account of his father's dangerous illness. On the following day the 9th Earl of Airlie breathed his last in Regent Street, London, thus affording another testimony to the truth of the old tradition that weird music and the sound of the drum haunt the dwellings of the Ogilvies prior to the death of a member of the family.
Section 18. Creslow Manor House. Creslow, in Buckinghamshire, like so many ancient English manor houses, has its family ghost. According to Dr. Lee, the old residence is haunted by the restless spirit of a lady long since deceased. She frequents a certain sleeping chamber in the most ancient portion of the building. She has not often been seen, yet has but too frequently been heard, and only too distinctly, by those who have ventured to sleep in or to enter after midnight the room she appears to deem hers. She is said to come up from the old groined crypt, and always appears to enter by the door at the top of the nearest staircase. After entering the chamber, she is heard to walk about it, sometimes in a stately manner, with her long silk train sweeping the floor, and at other times with a quick and hurried motion, with her silken dress rustling violently, as if she were engaged in a desperate struggle. The fact that the whole of this time the lady and her accessories are invisible adds in no slight degree to the horror of the affair. This haunted chamber, although furnished as a bedroom, is rarely used, and it is said that it cannot be entered even in the daytime, without trepidation and awe. However, some persons have been found bold enough to dare the harmless noises of the mysterious intruder, and many are the traditions current in Buckinghamshire respecting the results to these people of the adventure. The following will suffice as a specimen, and may, according to Dr. Lee, be depended on as authentic. About the year 1850, a gentleman, not many years ago High Sheriff of the county, who resides some few miles distance from Creslow, rode over to a dinner party. And as the night became exceedingly dark and rainy, he was urged to stay over the night, if he had no objection to sleep in the haunted chamber. The offer of a bed in such a room, so far from deterring him, induced him at once to accept the invitation. He was a strong-minded man of a powerful frame and undaunted courage, and, like so many others, entertained a sovereign contempt for all haunted chambers, ghosts, and apparitions. The room was prepared for him. He would neither have a fire nor a nightlight, but was provided with a box of lucifers that he might light a candle if he wished. Arming himself in jest with a cutlass and a brace of pistols, he took a serio-comic farewell of the family and entered his formidable dormitory. In due course morning dawned. The sun rose, and a most beautiful day succeeded a very wet and dismal night. The family and their guests assembled in the breakfast room, and every countenance seemed cheered and brightened by the loveliness of the morning. They drew round the table, when the host remarked that Mr. S., the tenant of the haunted chamber, was absent. A servant was sent to summon him to breakfast, but he soon returned, saying he had knocked loudly at his door, but received no answer, and that a jug of hot water left there was still standing unused. On hearing this, 2 or 3 gentlemen ran up to the room, and after knocking and receiving no answer, opened it and entered. It was empty. Inquiry was made of the servants. They had neither seen nor heard anything of him. As he was a county magistrate, some supposed that he had gone to attend the board which met that morning at an early hour. But his horse was still in the stable, so that could not be. While they were at breakfast, however, he came in and gave the following account of his last night's experiences. "Having entered my room," said he, "I locked and bolted both the doors, carefully examined the whole room, and satisfied myself that there was no living creature in it but myself, nor any entrances but those which I had secured. I got into bed, and with the conviction that I should sleep soundly as usual till 6 in the morning, was soon lost in a comfortable slumber. Suddenly I was awakened, and on raising my head to listen, I certainly heard a sound resembling the light soft tread of a lady's footstep, accompanied with the rustling as of a silk gown. I sprang out of bed, and having lighted a candle, found that there was nothing either to be seen or heard. I carefully examined the whole room. I looked under the bed, into the fireplace, up the chimney, and at both the doors, which were fastened just as I had left them. I then looked at my watch, and found it was a few minutes past 12. As all was now perfectly quiet again, I put out the candle, got into bed, and soon fell asleep. I was again aroused. The noise was now louder than before. It appeared like the violent rustling of a stiff silk dress. A second time I sprang out of bed, darted to the spot where the noise was, and tried to grasp the intruder in my arms. My arms met together, but enclosed nothing. The noise passed to another part of the room, and I followed it, groping near the floor to prevent anything passing under my arms. It was in vain. I could do nothing. The sound died at the doorway to the crypt, and all again was still. I now left the candle burning, though I never sleep comfortably with a light in my room, and went to bed again. but certainly felt not a little perplexed at being unable to detect the cause of the noise, nor to account for its cessation when the candle was lighted.
Section 19. Daintree. In the Reverend John Maston's History of Naseby is cited a story of an apparition that was supposed to have appeared to Charles I at Daintree, near Naseby, previous to the famous battle of that name. The army of Charles, says the historian, consisting of less than 5,000 foot and about as many horse, was ordered to Daintree, whither the king went with a thorough resolution of fighting. The next day, however, to the surprise of Prince Rupert and all the rest of the army, this design was given up, and the former one of going to the north resumed. The reason of this alteration in his plans was alleged to be some presages of ill fortune which the king had received, and which were related to me, says Mr. Maston's authority, by a person of Newark, at that time in his Majesty's horse. About 2 hours after the king had retired to rest, said the narrator, some of his attendants, hearing an uncommon noise in his chamber, went into it, where they found his Majesty sitting up in bed and much agitated, but nothing which could have produced the noise they fancied they had heard. The king, in a tremulous voice, inquired after the cause of their alarm, and told them how much he had been disturbed, apparently by a dream, by thinking he had seen an apparition of Lord Strafford, who, after upbraiding him for his cruelty, told him he was come to return him good for evil, and that he advised him by no means to fight the Parliament army that was at that time quartered at Northampton, for it was one which the king could never conquer by arms. Prince Rupert, in whom courage was the predominant quality, rated the king out of his apprehensions the next day, and a resolution was again taken to meet the enemy. The next night, however, the apparition appeared to him a second time, but with looks of anger, assuring him that would be the last advice he should be permitted to give him, but that if he kept his resolution of fighting, he was undone. If his Majesty had taken the advice of the friendly ghost, and marched northward the next day, where the Parliament had few English forces, and where the Scots were becoming very discontented, his affairs might, perhaps, still have had a prosperous issue. Or if he had marched immediately into the west, he might afterwards have fought on more equal terms. But the king, fluctuating between the apprehensions of his imagination and the reproaches of his courage, remained another whole day at Daintree in a state of inactivity. The Battle of Naseby, fought 14th June, 1645, put a finishing stroke to the king's affairs. After this he could never get together an army fit to look the enemy in the face. He was often heard to say that he wished he had taken the warning and not fought at Naseby, the meaning of which nobody knew, but those to whom he had told of the apparition which he had seen at Daintree, and all of whom were subsequently charged to keep the affair secret. Section 21 of the Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Edge Hill. In Lord Nugent's Memorials of John Hampden is cited, from a pamphlet of Charles I's time, one of the most, if not the most, marvelous account of 2 entire armies of apparitions on record. Somewhat similar, but more distant and weakly testified to phantoms are averred to have been seen in various times and climes, But as Lord Nugent points out, this wonderful story is attested upon the oath of 3 officers, men of honor and discretion, and of 3 other gentlemen of credit, selected by the king as commissioners to report upon these prodigies, and to tranquilize and disabuse the alarms of a country town, adding, moreover, in confirmation, their testimony to the identity of several of the illustrious dead, as seen among the unearthly combatants who had been well known to them, and who had fallen in the battle. A well-supported imposture, adds Lord Nugent, or a stormy night on the hillside might have acted on the weakness of a peasantry in whose remembrance the terrors of the Edgehill fight were still fresh. Footnote: the Battle of Edgehill, between the forces of the king and those of the Parliament, had been fought about 2 months previous to the first appearance of these apparitions. End note. But it is difficult to imagine how the minds of officers sent there to correct the illusions could have been so imposed upon. It will also be observed that no inference is attempted by the witnesses to assist any notion of a judgment of warning favorable to the interests or passions of their own party. The pamphlet referred to by Lord Nugent was printed immediately after the events it records, on the 23rd of January, 1642. It narrates the appearance of the late apparitions and records the particulars of the prodigious noises of war and battle at Edgehill, near Keynton, in Northamptonshire, and its truth is certified to by William Wood, Esquire, and Justice for the Peace for the same county, and Samuel Marshall, preacher of God's word in Keynton, and other persons of quality. Omitting the introductory matter, which merely refers to the antiquity of and the great mass of evidence in favor of the reality of apparitions, and modernizing the spelling, this strongly accredited pamphlet reads thus: Edgehill, in the very confines of Warwickshire, near unto Keynton, in Northamptonshire, a place, as appears by the sequel, destined for civil wars and battles, as where King John fought a battle with his barons, and where, in defense of the kingdom's laws and liberty, was fought a bloody conflict between his Majesty's and the Parliament's forces. At this Edgehill, at the very place where the battle was fought, have since and doth appear strange and portentous apparitions of 2 jarring and contrary armies, as I shall in order deliver, it being certified by men of most credit in those parts, as William Wood, Esquire, Samuel Marshall, minister, and others, on Saturday, which was in Christmas time, between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning, was heard by some shepherds and other countrymen and travellers, first the sound of drums afar off, and the noise of soldiers, as it were, giving out their last groans, at which they were much amazed, and amazed stood still, till it seemed, by the nearness of the noise, to approach them, at which, too much affrighted, they sought to withdraw as fast as possibly they could. But then, on the sudden, whilst they were in their cogitations, appeared in the air the same incorporeal soldiers that made those clamors, and immediately, with ensigns displayed, drums beating, muskets going off, cannons discharged, horses neighing, which also to these men were visible. The alarum, or entrance to this game of death, was one army, which gave the first charge, having the king's colours, and the other the Parliament's, at their head or front of the battle, and so pell-mell to it they went. The battle, that appeared to the king's forces seeming at first to have the best, but afterwards to be put into apparent rout, but till 2 or 3 in the morning, in equal scale, continued this dreadful fight, the clattering of arms, noise of cannons, cries of soldiers, so amazing and terrifying the poor men that they could not believe they were mortal, or give credit to their eyes and ears. Run away they durst not, for fear of being made a prey to these infernal soldiers, and so they, with much fear and affright, stayed to behold the success of the business, which at last suited to this effect. After some 3 hours' fight, that army which carried the king's colours withdrew, or rather appeared to fly, the other remaining, as it were, masters of the field, stayed a good space triumphing and expressing all the signs of joy and conquest, and then, with all their drums, trumpets, ordnance, and soldiers, vanished. The poor men, glad that they were gone that had so long stayed them there against their wills, made with all haste to Kington, and there, knocking up Mr. Wood, a justice of peace, who called up his neighbor, Mr. Marshall, the minister, they gave them an account of the whole passage, and averred it upon their oaths to be true. At which affirmation of theirs, being much amazed, they should hardly have given credit to it, but would have conjectured the men to have been either mad or drunk, had they not known some of them to have been of approved integrity, and so, suspending their judgments till the next night about the same hour, they, with the same men, and all the substantial inhabitants of that and the neighboring parishes, drew thither, where, about half an hour after their arrival, on Sunday, being Christmas night, appeared in the same tumultuous warlike manner the same 2 adverse armies, fighting with as much spite and spleen as formerly. And so departed the gentlemen and all the spectators, much terrified with these visions of horror, withdrew themselves to their houses, beseeching God to defend them from those hellish and prodigious enemies. The next night they appeared not, nor all that week, so that the dwellers thereabout were in good hope they had for ever departed. But on the ensuing Saturday night, in the same place, and at the same hour, they were again seen with far greater tumult, fighting in the manner aforementioned, for 4 hours, or very near, and then vanished, appearing again on Sunday night, and performing the same actions of hostility and bloodshed, so that Mr. Wood and others, whose faith, it should seem, was not strong enough to carry them out against these delusions, forsook their habitations thereabout, and retired themselves to some other more secure dwellings. But Mr. Marshall stayed, and some other, and so successively the next Saturday and Sunday the same tumults and prodigious sights and actions were put in the state and condition they were formerly. The rumour whereof coming to his Majesty at Oxford, he immediately dispatched thither Colonel Lewis Kirke, Captain Dudley, Captain Wainman, and 3 other gentlemen of credit, to take full view and notice of the said business, who, at first hearing the true attestation and relation of Mr. Marshall and others, stayed there till the Saturday night following, wherein they heard and saw the forementioned prodigies, and so, on Sunday, distinctively knowing divers of the apparitions or incorporeal substances by their faces, as that of Sir Edmund Barney, and others that were there slain,